Hello, welcome back. I hope you're well. We are back in sunny East Fife, where apparently it never rains anymore. Today's guest is Charlotte Blake, who is the founder of Free Your Instinct, which is now called Esprit Concrete. Charlotte has a background in working with people who have experienced trauma or mental health challenges, and her classes use parkour for empowerment, connection, confidence building, and all that kind of good stuff. She's just completed her PhD on parkour as a therapeutic intervention, looking at how movement can support people emotionally and socially and physically. Andrew met Charlotte a few years ago now at a conference, at the Adventure Mind conference, and he had been assigned to her workshop, not quite knowing what to expect, and was immediately sort of struck by how warm and inclusive and engaging it was, with people kind of high-fiving and crawling and problem solving and using the environment in really creative ways. And he thought, right, if I ever start a podcast, I'd really like Charlotte to be on it. So here we are with Charlotte. Charlotte's approach is grounded in ecological dynamics, which we use a lot at Wild Strong. If it's not something that's familiar to you, it's basically a way of seeing learning not as kind of following instructions, but as something that emerges through interaction with the environment. It's less of a kind of do it like this and more of a kind of let's explore this together and see what works with your body and what feels right for you. And she finds this approach really powerful because it mirrors how people actually experience the world, especially when healing from trauma or navigating mental health challenges. Charlotte really goes into what that looks like in practice in a kind of really human and relatable way, and shares how it's shaped her coaching and research and her life. So let's get into it.
How to stand on shifting sand. How to bend but stay intact.
Okay, I am here today with Charlotte Blake, and Charlotte is the founder, I guess, of Free Your Instinct, which is now known as Esprit Concrete, FYI. And I first met Charlotte probably about 2 to 3 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, and it was at Adventure Mind. It was a cool conference, and I remember that you were hosting a parkour workshop. I just thought it was excellent. I think I'd just been assigned to it, so I didn't really know what to expect. And as soon as you started, it was just such like a warm, inclusive experience. I remember you started off, people were giving each other high fives, and right away you had people crawling and moving and solving different problems and using the space in a really interesting way. And it just felt like everyone could participate in it. And I remember thinking, well, if I ever start a podcast, this is someone I'd really like to get on. So, Charlotte, I always ask people just to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about what they're doing now, what their projects are, their organizations, but also a little bit about how you got there. So you can take up as much time as you want with this. I'll just hand the mic over to you.
Yeah, so I founded Free Your Instinct back in 2014. As you rightly said, we now changed to Esprit Concrete. Esprit Concrete was a partner organisation of ours. So Free Your Instinct started with the objective of providing parkour to people with a recognised mental health need. Esprit Concrete developed parkour integrated therapeutic interventions. So it just made sense that we kind of merge and we can kind of share their methodology with our service users, and they can reach the people that they need to reach. So it was a natural partnership. I started parkour myself back when I was 22. I've recently turned 40, so many moons ago.
You got it early.
Yeah, I've just continued doing it since then. The impact that parkour had on my own mental health, I felt was something that would resonate and connect with other people. So I've recently finished my doctoral research at Leeds Beckett University, researching the impact of parkour as a treatment intervention for mental health, exploring it within an ecological dynamics framework.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good starting off point. So our audience is kind of, it's a mixed group. We have some GPs, some people who do lifestyle medicine. We have public health people. We have people, just moms and parents who are interested. We have, people in the fitness industry. So I think within the introduction you gave, there's probably some good points for us to start looking at. I guess, I mean, this is more of a personal question, but how did you get into parkour? Because I know a lot of people, they kind of at the time, a lot of people just found it on YouTube or early internet videos and they thought that was cool. And maybe they saw, I think it was the Nike commercial, that must have been back in like 2001 or 2000 or something like that. How did you personally get into it?
There was a video that came out around 2005, I think it was, called
Mhm.
Jump London. And
Yes. Yeah.
I'd seen it was, I think it was promoted on BBC News. And I remember
Mhm.
watching it on the news thinking, wow,
Yeah.
because it looked like they were skateboarding without the skateboard
Yeah.
in my head. I was into loads of different sports at that time. I was climbing, I was snowboarding. Obviously, I lived in London.
Yeah.
You can climb there, you can't really snowboard
Right.
in the middle of
Yeah.
London. Um, and I don't know if you remember back in like 2005, 2006, if you went through London Underground on a Friday, chances are
Mhm.
you would be handed a Sported magazine, which kind of covered every single sport. And one
Yeah.
Friday, there was this central spread talking about parkour. And at the very end of this magazine, of this article, was something for lessons. Now, when I saw it on the BBC thing, I just assumed it was like that's something that boys just pick up and do, like
Right.
BMXing or skateboarding. Like
Yeah.
they just seem to pick it up and do it. I didn't
Yeah.
realize there were lessons. So that lunch break, I went home, picked up my gym kit, went back to work. I went straight to the class after work, and I loved it. It was basically just an hour and a half of jumping around the walls a bit, just to let off some steam. And I remember it ending quite late. I think it was something like 7 till 9 or half
Wow.
7 till 9, which
Yeah.
on a Friday night, most people would be like down the pub,
Right.
having a couple of
Yeah,
drinks.
yeah, yeah. They're not gonna be
But for
jumping
me, it
off
was
of curbs and things. Yeah.
it was the best way to end the weekend. It just completely just reset me, ready to kick into the weekend and crack on. And the more that I practiced it, I started in the indoor classes, which in those
Mhm.
days you didn't have the gymnastics places that were,
Right.
sprung floors. It was,
Yeah.
school halls, wooden benches. There was still a risk of
Yeah.
hitting your shin on something.
Yeah.
Um, and then they started the outdoor classes, and just the amount of freedom that,
Mm.
as a, not to sound gender stereotypical, but as a
Yeah.
woman, if you go outside and you start moving like that and jumping like that,
Yeah.
there's a risk of who's watching. Am I not
Yes.
paying attention to my surroundings enough? But actually being able to do it in a class setting and almost being given permission to do it, I
Yes.
was able to kind of reconnect with the environment that I was so scared of. Like if I was walking home, you just kind of put your blinkers on
Yes.
and go.
Yeah.
It really empowered me within that environment to be like, yeah, I can own this space, I can do this, and not only that within my body,
Mhm.
and myself, and I know a lot of other female tressors, and tressors are people who do parkour.
Right.
Um, Generally, there'd be a lot of fear around their body. There
Yes.
was a message around that time that almost women had to be as small as possible. And
Yes.
actually, by doing that, it was like, I can be so strong. I can be
Yes.
so powerful within my own space. And that was a really empowering message for me that I really wanted to just grow on, I
Yeah.
suppose.
It's a funny, you said a lot of good things there, and it's funny because sometimes it's almost hard to remember what aspects of the past were like, and I think it's easy to forget what the mid 2000s were like in terms of culture and gender roles and how much things have changed. It's one of the things for most of our communities that we have at Wild Strong, the majority of participants are women, and I would say I think 100% of our community leaders are women. And the language that you use, this thing I hear so often, is like giving people an opportunity so they can give themselves permission to move, which is, yeah, it's very different. I think the way that men will express lack of confidence or self-consciousness sometimes is by overdoing it, like picking up the heaviest weight, trying to do it the fastest, sort of showing off in a sort of, bravado kind of way. And you'll see women come into class and you'll know that they can very comfortably, have one or two kids on each of their hips and a heavy bag, filled with like all kinds of snacks. They can easily like toss, multiple kgs around when they're picking up their kids. But when it's in the context of expressing strength or physicality, you just sort of see them become self-conscious about themselves.
Yeah, you walk into a gym and they pick up the 2 kilo dumbbells.
Yeah,
It's like
the
you've
little pink
just put
dumbbells.
down more than that.
Exactly, and there's it's an interesting thing. So I think you're right about that providing a space, providing an environment where people um, can express themselves. And it was, I just want to check because there's another point that you made that I thought was very good. Oh, yeah. It's just the obvious thing where I think we should probably get it out of the way is I think traditionally, as you mentioned before, is that parkour is seen as being more, and I think this is probably true if you look at the demographics, maybe not anymore, but more of a male space. It is something where it's seen, well, this is something where 20-year-old single men without kids participate in. And I don't know if that's changing, but I'm wondering if you could kind of speak on what the parkour community is like now and how it's changed.
I think there's still an element of that. I mentioned Jump London previously,
Mm,
and one of the points that I make in my thesis is that when parkour emerged in the UK, the focus on Jump London was about the big kind of
mm,
spectacle of parkour. The big jumps, the pull-ups. You think of the Casino Royale things.
yeah.
It needed that in order to differentiate itself from other things. It needed to be like, bam, this is us, this is what we are,
Hmm.
this is what we do. Um, but an analogy that I always use whenever I'm talking to people is, if you think of kayaking, you've got
Hmm.
kind of river and lake kayaking, which is, your nice, easy, bimbling
Yeah.
along. And then you've got your whitewater kayaking, which is like kind of, pow,
Yeah.
look what the human race can do. The high impact kind of performative elements of parkour, I think of like that. That is what it needed to be remembered, to be stuck into people's heads.
Hmm.
But actually, there's a whole other spectrum
Yes.
of what else parkour can be. So a lot of the work that we do as Free Your Instinct, as Esprit Concrete, and the approach that I take of parkour is it's about engaging with that person environment relationship.
Hmm.
So we work with where the individual is and help them to engage with that environment in a way that is comfortable for them. And what you find in most classes is that people will come with expectations of themselves. So I can't do this, I can't do that. You mentioned in the introduction that the session I did was very inclusive, and thank you for that. I'm very grateful. There were so many people that came to the session to me beforehand. There was one guy who was in remission from cancer, and he was
Hmm.
scared, which quite rightly so. I spoke to him and explained what we would be doing, and hopefully increased his confidence in that. There were multiple people coming with multiple different needs, wants, and conditions that had a perception of themselves that I can only do this and I
Hmm.
cannot do this.
Yeah.
Sorry, for those listening to this in audio, one
Yeah.
hand's lower, one hand's
Hands are
higher.
going lower.
Whereas what you find is that when you engage in a session where you're coming where the person is at, you let them play around in their comfort zone a little bit, and then you can start to build on that comfort zone. And generally, by the end of a session, the thing that they thought they couldn't do,
Hmm.
they're actually able to do. So then
Yes.
you start to, again, enable people to realize where their limitations are and where they can build on those limitations. So I'm sorry, I've lost the question completely.
No,
I completely forgot what we
that's
were
great.
talking about.
Actually, what you very gracefully did is you segued into the next question I was going to have anyway.
Oh, brilliant. I did that on
Well,
purpose.
yeah, no, it's very good. Usually, whenever I'm talking to someone with a parkour background, I always like to know what their definition of parkour is, because I think the thing that I always say is that in some ways, almost everything is parkour. Like engaging with the physical world around you is a form of parkour. But I'm probably being generous to myself because I don't have a parkour background, and I like to pretend, okay, well, I'm doing this as well. So that's the definition. But then I think other people have slightly different definitions, and I think you did just touch on it where you're talking about people engaging with their environment. But what is your definition of parkour? And then I've got a follow up question.
Obviously, the standard definition of parkour is moving through your environment from point A to point B using
Hmm.
running, jumping, climbing,
Yeah.
balancing, and things like that. In terms of kind of my professional understanding of parkour, throughout my thesis, we rest on a framework called ecological dynamics, which to me is parkour is the embodiment of ecological dynamics. So ecological dynamics is ecological psychology combined with dynamical systems theory, and it recognizes that we are all part of multiple dynamic systems. So it's not that in traditional kind of sports thinking or traditional healthcare thinking, where you've got the mind, body, and they both interact with each other.
Hmm.
Actually, they move together. They don't kind of react on each other. They are both interconnected. One
Yes.
will respond when the other reacts. So there is no kind of differentiation between those two. So for me, parkour is the engagement of all those systems within the environment that you're working with. So really engaging with that person environment relationship. So for me, parkour is that dialogue between
Yes.
yourself and the environment.
That's very good, and you very gracefully anticipated my next question, because I did want to talk about ecological dynamics and dynamical systems theories, and all the sort of various things that come along with talking about affordances and ecological dynamics, etc. I remember when I first started coming across this, and I think it was through Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. No, actually, I think it was actually learning about was learning about marketing. I remember when I first learned about Gibson and affordances, and that was a rabbit hole that got me in that years ago. But I'd just like to know, could you kind of tell me about, like, why you use this model? How it sort of clicked with you, what your experience was when you first started learning this way of looking at the world. And can you sort of, this is a tough one, can you give me some sort of concrete examples of how it's useful, or why other coaches or people in the space might find it a useful lens to make sense of the world?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So I first came across ecological dynamics when I started my PhD.
Mm,
I set up the charity For Your Instinct, and I had a conversation with Dr. Eric Breimer, who works with a lot of the leading voices on ecological dynamics, and he mentioned it and said, if this is a framework you want to use,
mm,
these are the literature that I recommend you reading. And the more I read it, as I say, for me, parkour is kind of an embodiment of the ecological dynamics principles. It just aligns so closely with it.
mhm,
But one of the things that I wanted to be sure I wasn't doing was just being too assumptive in
mm,
my analysis of the research that I was undertaking during my thesis. So I analysed a lot of my data initially just through thematic analysis to
mhm,
explore that if it's not ecological dynamics, what other frameworks could we be applying to that? So looking at things like the biopsychosocial model and things like that. And actually, what really persuaded me on ecological dynamics was the fact that yes, the biopsychosocial model recognized the biological, the social, and the psychological aspects. They were still, as I said before, those things kind of reacting off of one another
yeah,
rather than being interconnected.
yes,
For me, what needed to happen was almost like a big paradigm shift. With
mhm,
the ecological dynamics, it doesn't recognize the mind and body as distinct. It recognizes everything as kind of an interconnected system. Once you recognize that and you start using parkour as a means of engaging with that and
mhm,
understanding that relationship, the more um, kind of perceptive systems you have involved, your sight, your touch, your proprioception, which you have through parkour in multiple different ways that you wouldn't have through gym exercise. So for example, with running, you're running in one direction.
mm,
With picking up weights, you're picking it up, you're putting it back down again. With a lot of sports, with football, your upper body is very rigid. There's no kind of
yes,
movement in the central nervous system, in the spine. It's very two-dimensional. Whereas with parkour, it's three-dimensional movements. You're getting more of the systems involved with that environmental engagement. So for me, ecological dynamics explored the mechanisms at play in terms of the mental health benefit
mhm,
better than other theories.
yeah. And this is actually again what I want to talk about next. Is I did want to talk about parkour and mental health, and sort of, when you were practicing parkour, you mentioned yourself that you noticed that it was probably good for your own mental health. But can you talk about the genesis of Free Your Instinct, and really how it came together, and I guess also how it's evolved into Esprit Concrete as well? Because I'd really like to know more about the organizations, but also about your role in discovering, I guess, the synergy.
Yeah, so when I was establishing Free Your Instinct, I was working as an exercise instructor within two mental health hospitals. One was a
Mhm.
forensic mental health unit, and one was just an inpatient an inpatient unit. And obviously, you're working with kind of very complex needs. But one thing that I noticed was that whoever I was working with, there was always some level of history of trauma that almost in my head didn't seem to be taken into account in
Mm.
traditional kind of talking therapies or psychotherapeutic interventions. I remember I was looking through some of the case notes of the people I was working with in forensic mental health. Now, forensic mental health is when somebody is in an inpatient ward under the Ministry of Justice. So,
Mm.
whatever crime they have committed, it is due to their mental health, or they are not mentally well enough to be in a regular hospital, so they are in a forensic ward. And I remember looking back at some of their case histories and thinking, if I'd have had their history, if I'd have had their upbringing, if I'd have had
Mm.
their kind of the context that they'd had and then been presented with the situation that led them to their behavior, would I have behaved any differently? And I cannot, with
Yes.
a straight face, say that I would have, because
Yep.
when you learn certain values and you learn certain coping strategies and you put these all into one context and they've got to be able to defend themselves,
Yep.
they're going to draw on their history.
Yeah.
And again, when Eric was talking to me about the ecological dynamics framework, I realized that my coping strategy for working with these types of people, that is going through their case history, understanding that and understanding that this is what led them to that behavior, was kind of automatically introducing the ecological dynamics framework in
Hmm.
my
Yeah.
own method of working. And I can remember speaking with my manager at the NHS, and I even managed to somehow wangle a meeting with the director of the NHS service that I was
Wow.
working with, to be like, we need to get parkour into these services.
Mhm.
A lot of the work that I was doing in terms, because I also teach yoga and Pilates, I found that the more natural movement practices that I was doing with people had a much greater impact than just chuck them on a treadmill, which is
Yeah.
often what I was told by some of the ward staff.
Yeah.
And just trying to kind of say we need to get parkour in. Again, I was met with some of that kind of antisocial, anti-establishment. You know, why are we trying to teach forensic
Oh,
mental health
yes.
service users how to escape? And it's like, no, we're not
Yeah.
trying to teach them how to escape. We're just trying to help them engage with themselves and their environment in a much more positive way. Um, so I kind of stubbornly, I suppose, after being told by one director, I really like your idea, but we just can't afford it, set the charity up as a means of, well, there are other ways and means to do things.
Yeah.
Overcoming obstacles and problem solving, I
Yeah.
suppose. I answered it in the true parkour way.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's interesting. There's a couple places I want to go with this, and I think one of the last points you made, which is I think conflating any kind of physical activity or exercise as being the same thing. And what I mean is, a big part of what we always talk about is how I think some of our assumptions that we have about all physical activity is exercise. Exercise is something that you do in a gym. When you do in a gym, the way you move your body is through prescribed movements on certain machines, whether it's a treadmill, whether it's some kind of cable machine, or even if you're doing prescribed free weight exercises. This is a movement. It goes from A to B, etc. And I think lots of people do find benefit in that. I mean, the stat that I always use, which is probably more or less accurate every year, is that any one time only about 15% of British people have a gym membership, So obviously that is not a solution that is going to scale up because for whatever reason, going to gyms does not seem to be meaningful for a lot of people. Some people are wired that way. Some people, they love having their program and seeing the numbers go up and, seeing that they can do an extra squat or things like that. And I'm sort of like that. I've spent a lot of my time in gyms and I've really enjoyed the process of getting from 0 pull-ups to 1 pull-up to 10 pull-ups, whatever. It's great. Um, but then I also realized that there wasn't this level of engagement in the real world. I remember always being surprised when I started going to gyms and realizing that there actually wasn't that much skill transfer when I tried to interact with the physical world. I still wasn't very good at jumping. I was still very hesitant at interacting with the environment. And I still moved quite awkwardly. And I still do to a large extent. But I also feel like if as I spend more and more time outside of the gym, that I see all these, this host of benefits. So I guess the question out of that is parkour. And I think, almost any kind of like sort of embodied physical activity does seem to have a whole lot of benefits. Um, but it does feel like it's sort of hard to scale up, whether as a public health intervention or as a social movement. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but I know that you're one of the people trying to find a solution. So I was wondering if you could just kind of take that statement and respond to it.
Yeah, and I suppose again it goes right the way back to this person environment relationship. I'm going to go off on a tangent and then come back. So one
Yeah.
of the interviewees that I was speaking to for my research, I was trying to understand her background and how she ended up in an inpatient unit, and she was telling me this this narrative where she'd been experiencing this situation. I'm going to call it a delusion.
Hmm.
Obviously, for her at that time, she was still very unwell. She had a firm belief that they were true. So
Hmm.
she had these experiences. Then she was moved from one house to a hotel room where these experiences followed her there.
Hmm.
Now, you could say, well, within the ecological dynamics framework, you change the environment. So why did the situation not change? And that's where focusing on the relationship between the person and environment is essential, and where the biopsychosocial model doesn't quite cut it, because the biopsychosocial model says, well, we changed her living conditions, well, we've given her this, well, we've given her that, but actually she carried that relationship with her to her new surroundings. Now, what you find with a lot of interventions, and don't get me wrong, there has been so much amazing progress in the last 10 years. The
Hmm.
fact that on the government's most recent mental health and wellbeing plan, that they have started to kind of identify getting out into nature, but also bringing nature into urban environments, is incredible. But what I don't think enough appreciation has been given to is another finding that came out of my research was one of the participants of the community classes said, oh, well, I used to walk past that park all the time and think, well, what can you do there? So it's not just about changing the
Hmm.
environment, it's about changing the relationship we have to the environment.
Yeah.
Great, bring more natural things into the urban environment, but we are still going to have a don't walk on the grass mentality that we've been indoctrinated into
Yes.
having. So
Yeah.
unless we find a way of giving people permission to, you can go jump off
Hmm.
that, you can go play with that, you can climb up there and tic tac over it, that's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
We need to allow people to have those conversations with the environment. So
Hmm.
I think there is a lot of work that has to be done. I still get an awful lot of parkour that's really dangerous, or
Yeah.
parkour that's really antisocial, parkour you're just damaging property. We're not doing any of those
Yeah.
things with the work that we're doing. We're just allowing people to engage in their environment differently. So for me, I think if we're going to bring the benefits of nature-based physical activity into the urban environment, whether that's through park or whether that's through more nature-based objects or items or
Hmm.
activities within the urban environment, the relationship needs to be looked at as well.
Yeah. That's good. So I didn't even think you went off on a big tangent there. I thought that was very, very streamlined. Made a lot of sense. This is a question I wasn't planning on asking, but I think because we have been talking about mental health, and the way that you just framed the last answer, I think it's at least worth throwing out there. Do you think our current environment, the way society works, do you think it's making people sick? I mean, I know when the paleo movement sort of became big, there was talk of this mismatch theory, but it's not new. I mean, you can go back to Durkheim's writing, Marx's writing, ideas of like alienation and things like that. There does seem to be something about post-industrial society that it doesn't seem to be a good match for everybody. And I don't know if that is just people being naive and not knowing what the mental states of people were in the past. So, yeah, what do you think about that? And yeah, I mean, what can we do about it?
I mean, of course, it could be a mixture of both.
Yeah.
We are better at identifying mental health
Hmm.
difficulties in this day and age.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that's the correct way of phrasing it. You know, you look back at Aristotle and Plato and kind of texts written around that time. There's always, you know, the one that wouldn't pay attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's always there's
Yeah.
always references to conditions that we now see as fairly
Yes.
commonplace. So yes, there is the kind of, are we just overdiagnosing? Are we just more aware
Hmm.
of it now? But there is a lot of research that demonstrates that statistically you are significantly more likely to develop something like schizophrenia or
Hmm.
psychosis if you live in an urban environment. They did a number of longitudinal studies, and I'm terribly sorry I cannot remember the reference to them, where those who were born in rural societies but then moved to urban were still at less risk than those who were born in an urban environment where all their beliefs, their values, their coping strategies were developed within an urban environment and then moved
Hmm.
rural. They took all those beliefs with them and their
Yeah.
values and those coping strategies with them to the rural environment. So there is a lot of research that says that the urban environment is fatiguing.
Hmm.
We haven't really yet learned to evolve to it. You know,
Yes.
you think we've only really lived in an urban environment for 100 odd years. Um,
Yeah, I guess depending on how we define it, yeah. I think what we would think of as a modern urban environment. Yeah.
yeah, so we haven't really learned how to respond to it. And when you think of, you know, walls are there to stop you going places, to stop you. We haven't had the opportunity to have a dialogue with it as well.
Yeah.
So again, that for me, that's where parkour comes in, and you can actually have that. Well, what can I do here? What can't I do here? Rather than those rules being imposed on you, you understand the
Hmm.
purpose of, okay, well, I can get over this wall, I can't get over that
Yeah.
wall. I can go round this way, I can't go round that way. Rather than having those rules and values imposed on them, you choose to follow them. And I think that's the main difference, is the choice in our behavior rather than the
Hmm.
enforcement.
There are a lot of places I'd like to go with this. Based on your previous answer, I want to ask you about social media and computer usage, but I think I'm not gonna go there. Because I think that's a different can of worms. Because really, I'd like to know more about your practice and what you do and some of the populations you work with. With that, because we've already sort of talked about how parkour has this image of being, you know, very extreme and dangerous and things like that, and I think that is an image that is worth challenging. And obviously, if you're working with people coming from various backgrounds, these are people who probably often won't have a background in physical activity, I assume, probably don't think of themselves as, you know, traceurs or parkour practitioners coming in. So how do you introduce it? How do you bring people in to these classes? And then also, what do the classes look like? Because you know, where do you start, and how do you make these classes inclusive, and how do you include progression so people can see themselves getting better?
So in terms of how we get people involved, a lot of our classes are with younger people, and younger people
Hmm.
go, "Oh my gosh, parkour! Let's go do that."
Yeah.
So there is the element of novelty, of
Hmm.
kind of something being a bit cool. With
Yeah.
our classes for adults, especially if you see it on a mental health timetable, people are like,
Hmm.
"What? Why is that there?" So
Yeah.
they come kind of out of curiosity. Um, at least the more stubborn ones do. They're like, what's this about? I'm going to go give it a go. And generally, we find that uptake starts to pick up once somebody's gone like, what's parkour doing there? Oh, I went to that the other day. That was really fun. And then it builds by word of mouth. With adults, there is a little bit more kind of
Yes.
hesitance into
Hmm.
wanting to take part. So yeah, I think for children it's the novelty and the wanting to do
Yeah.
it. For adults,
Yeah.
when you see it on a timetable, there's that curiosity element
Yeah.
of it. And yeah, you're absolutely right. We work with people who either haven't done physical activity for a very long time, or even if they have, typically they can be on a high level of sedative
Hmm.
medications. So we had a group of, I think we did a Bangladeshi men's group where quite a few of them were on high levels of lithium. Lithium doesn't tend to get prescribed that much anymore, but obviously if you've got somebody that's been on it historically for a long period of time, they're not just going to randomly switch medications.
Right.
But that can really make people's muscles feel quite tight. So you'll see a lot of people on lithium, they'll have a bit of a shuffly walk,
Mm.
but actually when you get them moving and moving a bit freer. So we do things like just playful things like underbars or step vaults over a low wall, just things getting them moving in more of a 3D way. By the end of the class, just the freedom in their movement and the confidence in their movement as they've relearned, okay, well, I can do this and I'm going to move like that. And it is safe for me to do this. It may be that they turn up to the next class and they've got that
Yeah.
shuffly walk back on again, but it gives them that moment of freedom
Mm-hmm.
within their own body. So yeah, as I said before, in terms of what we get people to do, we make it playful, we make it fun. There is that element of almost self-competition, like, well, you've
Yeah.
reached this now, should we give the next stage a go, in order to achieve that progression, which is really, really encouraging to see. One thing you said was, how do we measure progress? For me, it's not about measuring the progress. One
Mm-hmm.
other thing that came out of my research was that, as I say, from my point of view, there's no differentiation between mind and body.
Mm-hmm.
And what we noticed when I was looking at the traceurs, the people who did parkour versus the other study, which was the people who attended mental health service users that attended a parkour intervention. Those that did parkour reported that when they were feeling low or when they were experiencing mental health symptoms, physically they were less able to do what they would normally be able to do. And now,
Yeah.
what that could lead to is a positive spiral or a negative spiral. If you turn up to a session thinking, I am rubbish, I am useless, I can't do anything, you're automatically in a negative mental
Yes.
state.
Yeah.
So your physical ability isn't going to be as good as it should be. Now, if you tie your worth to your physical ability, that's almost reaffirming, yes, I am
Yeah.
rubbish, yes, I can't do anything, because you keep missing that jump that last week you found so easy. So if
Yeah.
you're using your parkour progression as a measurement of achievement,
Yes.
it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy,
Yeah. I
or you
see.
can use it as a tool for analysis. So, okay, last week you could do this jump, this week you're finding it a bit more challenging. Shall we have a think about what's going on? Awesome. We'll start here, and then we'll start slightly lower. What you'll normally find is that by starting slightly lower, they reach that can cycle. Okay, so I can do
Mm.
this, I can do that, and they start to get back to the jump that they could do last week. So it's, for me, it's not necessarily measuring ongoing progress, but using how somebody is presenting that day as a tool for understanding how they're feeling that
Yeah.
day. Because another thing that you find with mental health and mental illnesses, and especially the populations I tend to work with those most at risk of the inequalities of mental health. So areas of recognized deprivation, as I say, Bangladeshi men's communities, things like that. These are populations that haven't necessarily been taught how to talk about their mental illness. So if you take them to cognitive behavioral therapy, it's like, so tell me what's wrong. I haven't been taught how to have the language for that. So you often find that people disengage from mental health services. But actually, if you can use a non-verbal tool like parkour to be like, okay, I could see we're finding that comfortable last week, but this week you're struggling with it. We know there's something going on. You can almost use it as a tool to understand that person a little bit better without them actually having to tell you. So that was often a tangent there, wasn't
No,
it?
that makes a lot of sense. I was thinking when I phrased the question, as soon as the word progress came out of my mouth, I was thinking, no, that's not really sort of what I mean. I kind of mean like, yeah, the kind of checking in with yourself, that you kind of see through physical engagement. But actually, I think that answer was really good. I really liked what you said about this idea of a can cycle as well. Like this, just sort of getting that momentum of building back up. Because I've been in that space as well with all sorts of things where obviously that interplay that we talk about in ecological dynamics, where for whatever reason, it's easy to kind of get into a negative self-talk cycle or whatever, pain avoidance cycle, something like that. But I really like the idea of finding a good spot to start that positive cycle to move back up again. Um, Something I wanted to talk about that we mentioned earlier before we started recording was something I hadn't thought about when I was writing the questions. Is I hadn't realized that you're a mother of two, and I think that this is something that's interesting because just like we said, in some ways, parkour at least has a gendered image. Um, I have not really talked to anyone who maybe that's not entirely true, but the idea of being a parkour coach and also being a mother at the same time as you're raising two children. Because, obviously there's so much in the philosophy of parkour in terms of risk and exploration and things like that. And sometimes that's in tension with our own feelings as parents. So I was wondering if you could talk about your experience.
Yeah, I am a massive hypocrite as a mother. I've got two boys and they are gorgeous. And what I've tried to instill in them is the same thing that I try to instill with a lot of my parkour kind of coaching development is fail small.
Mm.
If you make your mistakes at a lower level, then it becomes easier to reach those higher levels and know that you're not
Mm.
going to hurt yourself. A lot of people assume that you're going to get injured in parkour, but actually parkour is a lesson on risk avoidance. If you look at
Mm.
how a lot of people train, it's understanding how to manage and mitigate risk rather than, yeah, let's go do it.
Yeah.
So for my boys, I've tried to, if they want to do something, it's like, can you do that on the lowest step first? Okay,
Yeah.
now can you do it on the highest step? But they will do things that, as a coach, I know that what they're about to do is fully within their
Yes.
capability. As a mother, I'm really going grey.
Yeah.
And as I'm cheering them on, going, go on, sweetheart, you can do it. My heart is like, oh, I hope they're okay. So it is a tough balance. And I completely understand where so many mums and so many parents are coming from
Yeah.
when they say, oh, parkour is dangerous, is because you look at this and you think, that's my baby doing this.
Very hard
But
to
I
let
think
go. Yeah.
if your child is going to show an interest in that type of thing, teach them how to fail small. Also, what I try and instill in them is risk awareness. So if
Mm.
they're climbing up somewhere, it's like, have you got a firm foothold?
Yes.
One of the things that always made me laugh, when my eldest, sorry, was learning to walk, I'd be like, strong legs, sweetheart, strong legs,
Yeah.
rather than, watch where you're going or watch this or watch
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Strong legs. And I remember I was dropping him off at nursery once, and I had my youngest in the carrier, and I was feeling really tired because he's a baby, you've got this massive heavy carrier, and I went over on my ankle, just
Yeah.
slightly,
Just a little.
and
Yeah.
my eldest said, "Strong legs, mummy, strong legs." Which I was like, "Oh, sweetheart, you're
That's
adorable."
great. It's nice to hear that mirrored back in a positive way, isn't it? To think, oh, okay, there's something to parenting.
Yeah, it is scary as a mum, and I'd be hypocritical if I said it's not scary. But I think as long as you allow them to go through the stages of failing small, they learn how to mitigate and manage those
Yeah.
risks. Definitely.
Sorry, how old are your sons? I've got two sons as well.
6 and 4.
Okay, so we're very similar. What do we have? We have a 7 and a 5, who are both about to be 8 and 6. It's a fun
So it definitely
time.
is that way.
Yeah, yeah. Being a father and, being a dad has always been great. But I feel like now that I've hit that 5 and 7, it's like, it's for me, it's just really, really fun because you get to see how they're different people. You get to see what they do. You get to see how they handle different things. And, I said I wasn't going to talk about social media, but I'm just thinking about the kids now where I'm seeing this tension now where already with my eldest son, some of his classmates have, access to screens and they have access to phones and things like that and video games. And, just going back to this idea of, I think, ecological dynamics, one of the things that always makes me sad about spending so much time on screens is you lose this opportunity to really learn the tacit information of the world around you because like nothing is going to be as rich as the real world. And, you see there's something about, and I don't want to make it too gender, but there does seem to be something with boys where I think there is this attraction to video games that seems to resonate differently. And obviously everybody's different. And, there are lots of girls that play video games and lots of boys that don't. But now just as a parent, it's one of the things that I'm sort of having trouble with is balancing this, ensuring that I give them access to physical activity and get them outside and things like that. But also just thinking about how I navigate that space. So I was just wondering, how do you do that? How do you kind of get more physical activity opportunities in with your boys? And how do you also balance that out with the other expectations that kids have?
I'm quite flexible with screen time, I have to admit.
Yeah.
The way I see it is, obviously they don't have a massive amount of screen time, but
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
live
I'm
in a
not a
world
purist
where
either.
they are
Yeah.
likely to be
Yeah.
working on computers. They're likely
Exactly.
to have to do most of their schoolwork on
Hmm.
computers. So by not giving them some exposure to that, they're not developing alongside their peers. I'm quite fortunate that my kids don't play computer games yet. They just don't seem to have shown too much of an interest in it, which is quite
Yeah,
good.
that's good.
They do watch. We had YouTube on the other day, and my youngest was
Mm.
like, "I want to watch the Planet song, mummy." So I try and keep it
Yeah,
as educational as possible. Obviously, that's you've got to let them have some kind of freedom to explore
yeah, I think so.
stuff. Obviously, not too much freedom with the internet,
Yeah,
but freedom to explore the subjects that they like, the things that they want to watch. But if we've got a song about the solar system going on repeat, I'm absolutely fine with that.
yeah,
But what I try and balance it out is like, okay, so you can watch TV for the morning, but then we're going to go to the skate park, or then we're going to go to the nature reserve or something like that. So then
mhm,
we get the waterproofs on, we get the helmets on, and we get out into any type of weather possible, and they absolutely love that. I have to admit, I'm guided by them most of the time. I'm sat there thinking, oh gosh, it's raining, do I really have to go out again?
yeah,
And they're like, mummy, I want to go skate park. So I suppose I'm lucky in the sense that kind of 4 and 6, you can
mhm,
be good, but I find I am guided by their
yeah,
enthusiasm to want to go and do it. They still really love that idea of exploring and
that's
playing
great.
with sticks and playing with mud, and yeah.
Yeah. We live quite rurally, so I've talked about it on the podcast before. About 6 or 7 months ago, I just started making loads and loads of these like sort of foam covered swords. So they're sort of they're old golf shafts, like old carbon fiber golf shafts. So they're really light, and I just put some foam on them, a bit of duct tape, and we've got big swords, little swords, and it's been so fun to watch my kids and the neighborhood kids just see what they do with a load of like 15 swords, and they make all kinds of games, and they play capture the flag, and yeah, I'm really amazed with what kids can do with just a few sticks and
Yeah.
the space to play around. We've got a bit of time, but we're coming towards the end, so I kind of want to think about some big picture stuff. I think what you do is really great, and I think anyone who's listening to this is probably also really interested. So I think people probably have a question like, "This is great. How do I get involved?" Or "How can I bring parkour or some kind of movement to my community?" If they're not living in the UK, or if they're not living near you, how can people start this, especially parents and adults, if it's something that they kind of feel like they want to be a part of and they see the merit of it? How can people start this?
Obviously, there are classes that you can go to. They're not everywhere. I think
Yeah,
especially even in the UK, there are kind of pockets of classes, and then
yeah,
there won't be anything for a few miles.
yeah,
So the classes are still fairly few and far between. In terms of the kind of introduction movements, there is quite a lot that you can learn from YouTube videos and things like that
mhm,
without getting into that kind of high spectacle that most people will need the kind of stages before that. I would say, if again, this is where social media can be really good at connecting people across
mm,
distances. I've engaged with people who are all over the world that I would have never otherwise met because of Facebook groups or because of social media. And I think that's where positive use of social media can really come together. So if people search for a local parkour group, they're really supportive and really helpful, and they want to get
yeah,
people involved with that,
yep,
and they can give you kind of hints and tips on where the local coach is, or where the local classes are even. And the reason I'm focusing on classes and coaches and people who have done it before is because of that element of being given permission to do it. A lot of people
mhm,
will be nervous about it because they'll be like, right, okay, so I'm going to start and I'm going to practice this, this, and this. And I'm going to practice it here, and they'll turn up at that location, and be like, oh, but what if somebody's watching? What if somebody sees me?
yeah,
That CCTV camera's pointing in the wrong direction, and all these pre-existing concerns will start to
mhm,
kind of bubble up in their head. Whereas actually, if you can have somebody either computerally or physically present that says this is okay, it takes some of that mental challenge away from it to enable you to get started in the practice. And the most important thing is to just get started. Start with
yeah.
where you are, start with what you can do, and find that can cycle.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, I've always found the parkour community to be incredibly positive and incredibly welcoming. That's why I always thought it was interesting when there's this perception they have a bad attitude or they destroy property or something like that. Because I've always just found them just be really, really nice people. So I think that's one of the things that's worth knowing. So what's next for you? You finished your work for your PhD, right?
Yes. So I've got I
Congratulations.
passed my viva in October, so I'm just submitting my final amendments, and I graduate later this year.
That's great. Congratulations on that. It must have been a big step deciding to start all that. So what's next? What are some future projects you have? What are some things that you're optimistic about? Some things you're looking forward to?
We've got a number of different projects kind of coming up over the next couple of years. With the partnership with Esprit Concrete, one of the things that they've previously done is, obviously we deliver the classes, but then we've also got a performative element, which we've had productions that are focused on schizophrenia, on grief, on depression. So kind of visually discussing those difficulties and those illnesses in a way that raises attention with the general public. So we've been speaking about how we can do more of the kind of awareness raising through parkour. Obviously, keeping on what we're doing with the courses, getting as many people engaging in parkour as a means of managing their mental health, and seeing where we go from there.
That's great. Thanks so much for your time. You covered a lot of really interesting things. I really appreciate you taking the time because I know that you're busy, and I know that you've had a really busy year. So thanks for making the time to have the chat.
No, thank you for inviting me on, and thank you for your kind words as well. It's really nice to know that the work we're doing is appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise.
And we're back. How did you get on? Thank you so much, Charlotte, for coming on. I loved that episode. I think there's a lot in there. I was just writing notes on my walk while listening. It's a really nice reminder that progress isn't always doing these big jumps and really complex movements. And sometimes it's just about showing up and sticking at it and starting again. I liked her idea about failing small and rebuilding trust in your body. I guess as well what came through was how much Charlotte really just cares about the people she works with deeply, and that she's working with people who have so often been overlooked by traditional systems. And it's not about fixing you. It's about creating a kind of environment where you can reconnect with yourself and with others and feel strong and in a way that is meaningful to you on your own terms. Thank you, Charlotte. I thought that was a really great episode. And you can find all of the links to Charlotte's work in the show notes. As ever, if you enjoyed this episode, please do take a minute to subscribe or leave a review or write a comment, because it really helps us find other people, because we're just a very small podcast in a large podcast world. Next week, we will be back with Dr. Hussein Al-Zubaidi, who is a GP and a lifestyle medicine lead who's really passionate about physical activity and prevention. And he'll be chatting to Andrew, talking about where physical activity fits in healthcare, what stops people from getting started, and how we can build communities that move together. It's a really, really good one. And I hope to see you then. Okay, bye.